She parked her $300,000 Rolls-Royce across his driveway like it belonged to her. No permission, no apology, just entitlement wrapped in designer sunglasses. But what Judge Clarissa Whitmore didn't know was this. The man whose space she took wasn't just some quiet retiree. He was a former state prosecutor, and he was watching, waiting, and collecting every piece of evidence he'd need to bring her world down, legally and completely. On the quiet, tree-lined streets of a well-manicured Atlanta suburb, everything looked picture perfect. White picket fences, trimmed hedges, and American flags fluttering in soft spring breezes. It was the kind of neighborhood where lawns were mowed on Saturdays, and people waved even if they didn't know your name. The kind of place where people liked their peace, especially Reggie Carter. At 62, Reggie had earned his quiet life. Once a respected state prosecutor for Georgia, he had retired early, choosing calm over courtroom chaos. He lived alone in a red brick bungalow with a wide porch and a rocking chair that creaked just enough to keep the rhythm of the birds. Every morning was the same. A black coffee in hand, newspaper folded neatly on his lap, and the soft hum of jazz on the radio. He didn't bother anyone, didn't gossip, didn't overstay small talk. He minded his business and expected others to do the same. But that morning in April, something changed. A pearl-white Rolls-Royce Phantom glided down the block like royalty entering a commoner's village. It didn't stop at its owner's home. It didn't even slow down. Instead, it pulled right into Reggie's driveway, cutting across his walkway as if it had been paid for and paved by her. Judge Clarissa Whitmore. The name was familiar. She was all over the news on local panels, quoted in papers, respected by some, feared by others. She stepped out like a scene from a courtroom drama. Blazer flawless, heels sharp, chin tilted just so. She didn't glance at Reggie's porch, didn't wave, didn't acknowledge the intrusion, just locked her car with a beep and walked away, like it meant nothing. But to Reggie, it meant everything. Not because she blocked his car, but because she stepped on something far more important. His respect, his dignity, his space, and she was about to learn. Some men don't raise their voice. They raise the truth. It happened again. Not a week later, not in passing, not by mistake. It was Tuesday morning. Same car, same arrogance, same blocked driveway. Reggie had just returned from a trip to the local hardware store. Nothing more than a couple of new hose fittings and a bag of fertilizer. He turned onto his street, and there it was. The Rolls-Royce Phantom, glimmering like a crown in the spring sun, once again occupying his private driveway. No note, no explanation, no respect. He sat in his car for a full minute, engine running, eyes fixed on the back of the luxury vehicle. Then he turned the ignition off, slowly, silently. That was the moment something shifted. Not in rage, not in revenge, but in clarity. He didn't knock on her door. He didn't leave a sticky note. He didn't wave at her from the porch, hoping to spark a polite conversation. He walked straight into his house, opened a drawer, and pulled out an old manila folder. Inside was a blank legal pad, a pack of sticky tabs, and a pen he hadn't used since his last court case. And then the first entry, April 11th, unauthorized vehicle parked on private property, 9:32 a.m., photographed. No contact attempted. He stood at the window watching, observing, not angry, focused. From that moment on, Reggie began building a timeline. Each time the car showed up, he logged the date and time. He took pictures, not with emotion, but with precision, from multiple angles, with timestamps. He even measured the distance between the back tires and his mailbox. The evidence wasn't just visual, it was clinical. He installed a small motion-activated security camera above his garage, another under the porch light. He didn't mention it to anyone, he didn't need to, because he wasn't trying to make noise. He was building a case. Clarissa, of course, remained entirely unaware. She kept parking, kept striding out of her Rolls-Royce like the street belonged to her, kept ignoring the man she believed was too quiet to matter. Once she waved at him, not kindly, condescendingly, that kind of wave you give to someone you've already decided is beneath your time. Reggie nodded back, slightly, not out of politeness, but out of certainty, because by then he already had a dozen entries, 3 separate videos, multiple photos, and a copy of the deed to his property, which clearly marked the driveway as part of his legal lot. He even dug through his old legal contacts to find a friend still active in civil litigation, just to brush up on property access laws and civil harassment statutes. Not because he wanted a fight, but because if one was coming, he wasn't going to show up unarmed. By the end of the month, Reggie had a folder so organized it could have been used in court that same day, and soon it would be. But what he didn't know yet was that Clarissa Whitmore wasn't just about to continue the pattern, she was about to escalate it, and this time, she would go too far. Clarissa Whitmore didn't like being ignored, and over the weeks, Reggie's silence began to get under her skin. She wasn't used to being watched without response. She was used to people reacting, nervously, respectfully, obediently. But Reggie Carter, he didn't flinch, didn't complain, didn't even look irritated. And that unsettled her more than yelling ever could. So she escalated. It started with a letter, delivered by certified mail. Formal notice of harassment and threatening behavior. It read in neat legalese, printed on expensive cream paper with a gold embossed letterhead, the office of Judge Clarissa Whitmore. In it, she accused Reggie of staring at her property, of following her car movements, and, most absurdly, of attempting to intimidate a public official. She claimed he had been documenting her inappropriately and causing her emotional distress. It was a laughable distortion of reality, but it was also dangerous because it came from someone with power, and she knew how to wield it. 2 days later, Reggie received a court summons. She had filed a civil protective order against him, attempting to legally bar him from engaging in any surveillance, contact, or intimidation. If granted, the order would effectively strip him of his ability to document her violations and hand her complete control of the narrative. To most people, it would have been a devastating moment. But Reggie, he just sat down at his dining room table, opened his manila folder, and smiled. Just a little. On the day of the hearing, Reggie walked into the courtroom wearing a gray blazer and calm eyes. His stride was slow but sure. He carried no entourage, just a small briefcase, well-worn but polished. Clarissa was already seated at the petitioner's table, flanked by her personal attorney. She wore a crisp navy suit and a scowl. She didn't look at Reggie when he entered, but her shoulders tensed. Maybe she felt it, that something was about to turn. When the judge, not her, but a neutral federal magistrate, asked for Clarissa's statement, she spoke with confident indignation. Her voice was firm, her words rehearsed. She painted Reggie as a vindictive neighbor obsessed with her property, misusing surveillance to harass and stalk. She played her role well, right up to the moment Reggie stood up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't counter her accusations with anger. Instead, he pulled out a printed timeline of events, dates, times, photos, and video stills. Then, one by one, he laid them on the table, calmly, neatly, like chess pieces. He presented video footage of her vehicle trespassing repeatedly, blocking access, and her own dismissive comments, captured clearly through porch audio. Then he submitted a copy of his property deed. And finally, an email Clarissa had accidentally CC'd to a neighborhood board member joking about parking on the porch of that ex-lawyer who thinks he owns the block. The room went still. Even her attorney leaned in, suddenly less confident. The judge leafed through the materials, silent, focused. Then came the ruling. There is no evidence of harassment by the respondent. However, there is clear evidence of ongoing trespass, misuse of legal processes, and possible abuse of authority under color of law. Petition denied. And just like that, Clarissa's case collapsed in front of her. But the judge wasn't finished. Mr. Carter, if you choose to pursue counterclaims, civil or criminal, you have grounds. Clarissa's face drained of color. Reggie didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply stood, nodded respectfully, and walked out of that courtroom with the same quiet strength he'd carried since day one. She tried to use the law as a weapon, but Reggie reminded her, some men are the law. Clarissa Whitmore walked out of that courtroom with her heels clicking fast and hard against the marble floor, like she could outpace the truth now trailing her like a shadow. But she didn't speak a word, not to her lawyer, not to the press, not to Reggie, and certainly not to the neighbors. Because while she was busy crafting legal threats and courtroom drama, the street she lived on, so manicured, so proper, so politely silent, had begun to pay attention. It started small. A neighbor across the street, Mrs. Halberd, 73, with two Yorkshire Terriers and a sharp memory, had watched Clarissa park in Reggie's driveway more than once. At first, she thought it was strange. Then it started to feel deliberate. She told a friend. That friend told another, and then someone found the court date online. And that's when the stories came pouring in. She fined my grandson for leaving a skateboard on the sidewalk. She told me my garden gnome was lowering property value. She threatened to report my daughter for running a business because she sold lemonade on the weekend. Reggie's quiet defense in court had done more than protect his driveway. It had opened the floodgates. For years, people had whispered about Clarissa Whitmore's grasp on the neighborhood, her HOA power plays, her thinly veiled threats, her way of smiling when she sanctioned you. But no one had stood up to her until now. A week after the hearing, flyers started showing up. Not from Reggie. He never lifted a finger. But someone, likely a neighbor with a printer and a long memory, posted laminated notices on every mailbox. Know your rights. HOA guidelines aren't law. Speak up. Ask questions. Below that, a picture of Reggie Carter standing at his porch, sipping coffee like nothing happened. Clarissa saw the flyers on her morning walk. She tore one down, then another. But by evening, they were back up, taped tighter than before. At the next HOA meeting, the energy was different. It wasn't just the regulars. There were new faces, older couples who never used to come, young families with toddlers. A quiet, almost electric tension filled the room. Reggie sat near the back. No briefcase, no folder, just his usual stillness. Clarissa, seated at the front of the board, tried to carry on as if nothing had changed, but her voice lacked its usual steel. And her allies, they were shifting in their chairs, avoiding eye contact. Then Mr. Franklin, a retired Navy vet and former HOA supporter, raised his hand. Madam Chair, he said slowly, how do you explain the recent legal action against one of our residents? Clarissa blinked. This isn't the place, she started, but Mrs. Halberd interrupted. This is exactly the place. And that's when the meeting turned. People spoke, and once they started, they didn't stop. About years of fines, intimidation, and misuse of HOA authority. About how one woman's control had gone unchecked for far too long. Clarissa tried to defend herself, but her words fell flat. There was no courtroom here, no gavel, just a room full of people who had finally found their voice. And Reggie? He didn't say a word. He didn't have to, because sometimes the most powerful voice is the one that gave others permission to speak. The room fell quiet. Not the kind of silence that comes from boredom or routine, but the kind that follows a shift, a change in power, a reckoning. For years, Clarissa Whitmore had presided over HOA meetings like a judge in her courtroom, smiling, commanding, correcting. People nodded, people complied. But tonight, no one was nodding. After nearly an hour of residents speaking, calmly, firmly, about abuses of power, petty fines, and personal intimidation, the HOA chair, Mr. Delgado, cleared his throat. A soft sound, but enough to call the room to attention. Per HOA bylaws, he began, when formal complaints are submitted against a board member, especially regarding misuse of authority, a vote must be held to determine whether their position remains tenable. Clarissa stiffened. Her pearl necklace caught the light as she turned toward him. You can't be serious, she said, voice low but sharp. This is nothing more than a personal vendetta, instigated by someone who couldn't handle a disagreement. She looked across the room. Her gaze landed briefly on Reggie. He didn't blink. Delgado continued, this vote isn't about personalities. It's about principles, about how we treat each other, about whether leadership is being used to protect the community or to punish it. He nodded toward the table at the front. One of the volunteers passed out slips of paper. No electronic tally, no apps, just pen, paper, and quiet hands. Clarissa folded her arms. Across the room, Reggie sat still. No pen in his hand. He wasn't voting. He wasn't on the board. He was just witnessing. and somehow that made his presence louder than words. It took only 5 minutes to collect the ballots. It took only 12 votes to decide. And when Mr. Delgado stood again, holding the folded papers like a weight in his hands, the whole room leaned in. By a unanimous decision, he said, Judge Clarissa Whitmore is hereby removed from the HOA board, effective immediately. There was no applause, no celebration, only the kind of silence that follows truth being spoken plainly. Clarissa didn't argue. She didn't shout. She simply gathered her papers, stood, and walked out of the room, heels clicking against the floor, each step echoing a little louder than the last. She didn't look back, not at the board, not at her neighbors, not at Reggie Carter. Outside, the streetlights hummed against the dark Georgia sky. A few residents lingered in the parking lot, whispering to each other, not about Reggie, but about what came next, what the neighborhood could be now that the shadow had lifted. Reggie stepped out into the cool night air, his hands in his pockets. A few neighbors nodded as he passed. He nodded back, still silent, still steady, because sometimes real change doesn't come from the loudest voice. It comes from the one who simply refuses to be moved. 2 weeks later, a for sale sign appeared on Clarissa Whitmore's perfectly manicured lawn. No announcement, no goodbye letter, no last-minute HOA memo. Just a sign, white with red trim, staked into the grass like a quiet surrender. She stopped attending meetings. Her Rolls-Royce disappeared from the driveway. Curtains stayed drawn, porch lights off before sunset, and by the end of the month, she was gone. No farewell brunch, no moving truck send-off. Just gone. The street felt different after that. Not louder, not busier, but lighter somehow. The kind of stillness that feels earned, not empty. Like after a long storm, when the sky's clear and all that's left is the sound of sprinklers and birds and wind in the trees. Reggie noticed it the most. He still woke up at 6:15, still drank his black coffee on the porch, still pruned the hedges and waved at passing neighbors. But now the waves came back with more than just politeness. They came with purpose. One morning, as Reggie sat outside with a crossword puzzle and the gentle hum of an old jazz station, Mrs. Halberd walked by with her Yorkies. She paused at the edge of his walkway. "You didn't have to do what you did," she said softly, "but I'm sure glad you did." Reggie smiled. Just a little. Didn't say much. He rarely did. But after she walked on, he folded the newspaper in his lap and looked out across the neighborhood. A kid was riding his bike down the sidewalk, helmet askew, shoelaces untied. No one yelled at him. No one fined his parents. No one called it a safety concern. Just a kid, being a kid. That afternoon, two younger neighbors, new parents, dropped by with a plate of cookies and a thank you note. For standing up, the note said, when we didn't know we could. And that was the truth. Reggie hadn't just reclaimed a driveway. He'd reclaimed a sense of dignity, and in doing so, gave everyone around him permission to do the same. He never raised his voice, never made it personal. He didn't fight fire with fire. He fought it with facts, with grace, with patience. And in the end, the community remembered that kind of strength. Not the kind that barks orders, but the kind that stands still when others try to push it over. On a quiet Sunday morning, Reggie stood on his porch, cup of coffee warming his hands. The street was calm, the breeze was gentle, and for the first time in a long while, his driveway was empty. Just concrete and sunlight. No Rolls Royce, no drama, just peace. And sometimes that's all a man ever really wanted. Sometimes the most powerful victories come without applause. They arrive quietly, like Reggie Carter on his porch, sipping coffee, watching peace return, one breath at a time. This wasn't a courtroom drama filled with shouting. It wasn't about revenge or winning some petty feud. It was about dignity, principle, and the right to stand your ground without becoming the thing you're fighting against. In today's world, especially for those of us over 50 or 60, it can feel like people aren't listening anymore. Like if you speak softly, you'll be overlooked. That standing for something only counts if you shout, post, argue, or fight loud. But stories like Reggie's, narrated stories that unfold in real neighborhoods, on real streets, remind us that quiet doesn't mean weak, That respect doesn't have to be demanded, only protected. That sometimes the most incredible stories begin not with anger, but with calm, with clarity, with quiet resolve. Reggie didn't set out to become a symbol. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He simply wanted to be left in peace. But when that peace was violated, he didn't explode. He organized. He didn't threaten. He documented. And when pushed into a corner, he didn't raise his fists. He raised the truth. That's what makes this such a touching story. Not because it's flashy, but because it's familiar. Because so many of us have been Reggie. We've smiled when we were disrespected. We've taken the high road, even when no one noticed. We've been told to just let it go, to stay quiet, to not rock the boat. But sometimes, enough is enough. This heartwarming story isn't just about a man in a driveway. It's about a larger truth. That courtesy should never be confused for weakness. That no matter your age, your race, your past, your space, your time, and your voice all matter. And when one person has the courage to say, this isn't right, it gives others permission to do the same. That's how neighborhoods change. That's how cultures shift. Not always with protests or politics, but with small acts of courage, repeated often, and done well. At Unraveled Fates, we believe these are the stories worth telling, not just because they inspire us, but because they reflect us. They echo our frustrations. They mirror our quiet struggles. They validate the times we chose integrity when no one was watching. These are the narrated stories that linger, the touching stories that stay in your heart long after they're told, the incredible stories that begin with someone just like you, sitting quietly on a porch, choosing principle over pride, and writing a new ending, one choice at a time. So if this story moved you, if you saw a piece of yourself in Reggie, or if you've ever been underestimated for being too quiet, too kind, or too respectful, we hope you'll share this video, because the world doesn't just need more noise. It needs more truth, more grace, and more incredible, heartwarming stories just like this. And if you're listening, that means you're part of this one now too. If this story spoke to you, if it reminded you of a time when you stood your ground or wished you had, then take a moment to let it sink in. Because stories like Reggie Carter's don't just entertain us. They remind us of who we are, of what we still believe in: respect, decency, and quiet strength. At Unraveled Fates, we're here to tell those stories. Narrated stories that move you, touching stories that feel personal, incredible stories that show what can happen when ordinary people choose courage over comfort. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next one. Like this video to help others find it, and leave a comment below.